Artificial intelligence is transforming how we educate and train our health workforce. SimConverse has trained an AI to understand the English language and use this understanding to play the role of any patient, colleague, or casualty in any given verbal communication scenario. Every conversation is followed by theory-based assessment and reflection that is tailor-made to suit your needs. We provide hundreds of institutions the ability to train or assess communication skills from a classroom through to the accreditation of your entire health workforce. If you're passionate about improving tertiary and workforce training, we're looking forward to meeting you soon at the International Forum on Quality and Safety in Healthcare.
So, welcome back. I hope you've been all enjoying today, being back with friends and colleagues as much as I have, and it's not over just yet. We've got a reception coming up very shortly, more about that soon. But first, please welcome to the stage our final keynote speaker of the day, Derek Feeley from IHI.
Well, you said you were going to be brief. I didn't expect that brief. Thank you, Ashley. I think of all the introductions I've ever had, that was easily the most recent. Did anybody notice that guy who was speaking this morning, that Ewan Wallace guy? What a strange accent he had. I could barely make out a word he said. I'd like you to do me a favor, if you don't mind, and if you're able. Could you stand up? This is a session on well-being and joy, so feel free to stretch. And then once you've done that, I'm going to make it a little bit more complicated. So you'll need to engage your brains for this bit, because I would like I'd like 1 and 3 of you to remain standing. So find a little group of 3. 1 and 3 of you remain standing. 2 and 3, sit back down. Well done. I think you've done a pretty good job. It's close enough for my purpose, which is, what if I was to tell you that this is roughly the proportion of the audience that, according to a recent survey in Victoria, the proportion of the healthcare workforce that was burned out. And I don't mean the people who are standing up. I mean the people who are sitting down. That's the proportion of the healthcare workforce that are burned out. 2/3. You can all sit down again. Thank you for humouring me. And so we want to try and explore some of those issues today. You'll see I'm talking here about workforce well-being and joy in work, and I'm going to try and identify the difference between some mythical thinking that I think has grown up and some real-life truths, or at least my truths. And I'll use the terms workforce well-being and joy in work almost interchangeably. I know they're different. I'm just lazy. But just roll with that, if you don't mind. We talk about joy in work because, important as the wellness of the healthcare workforce is, so too is their feelings of self-esteem and belonging and what Maslow would call self-actualization. And so joy extends the scope of our work beyond well-being. So just as well-being is more than the absence of disease, joy is more than the absence of burnout. And I think it's right to be ambitious like that. I'm going to describe to you later on a set of programs that IHI has been working on, including one in partnership with Safer Care Victoria, where we are really tackling this issue of well-being and joy in work. Can you imagine the reception that would get if we said, well, we're just going to make the healthcare workforce a little bit less burned out? It probably wouldn't be quite as engaging as saying we're going to create joy in work. Although, when we first started to talk about joy in work, this is the kind of talk about skeptical. You could see people actually cringe when we started to talk about this. And I think, looking back, it was because people couldn't see a path from current state to future state. And now we can describe that kind of journey to them, and I will try and do that later on in the presentation. You'll need to stay to nearly the end for that, though. But you're going to stay to the end anyway, because right after me is refreshments. So that's good. It's always good to be on just before the reception. I won't keep you beyond the time. It's not a new idea. W. Edwards Deming was talking about joy back in the 60s and 70s. He saw it as a fundamental part of the science of improvement, part of the psychology of change. And his language, I think, is interesting. He doesn't say people might aspire to joy in work, or we should seek joy in work. He said people are entitled to joy in work. In Deming's eyes, joy in work is a right. And I think it might be interesting for us if we thought about joy in work as a right. Because then, like other human rights, such as the right to education, it would come with a guarantee of participation and accountability and non-discrimination and engagement and legal protection. So park that idea in your head, because we'll come back to joy in work as a right in due course. This is a huge global problem. I think it's the biggest problem facing healthcare right now. And if we don't tackle this, the consequences for healthcare are really quite scary. And you can see here the scale of the problem. This is pre-pandemic. 35 to 54% of nurses and physicians substantial symptoms of burnout. In medical students and residents, even higher. And this is American data, but I could have shown data from the UK or from Australia, it would have looked much the same. The bit about medical students and residents, I think, is particularly worrying, because they're our future. And these are young men and women in their 20s and 30s, already burned out. Important, I think, to be clear about what we're talking about when we talk about burnout and its potential antidotes. It's more than just stress. It's feeling disengaged from your work, detached, with your emotions not as you would want them to be. Your motivation lost, your irritation enhanced, and regular and repeating symptoms of depression. It's a serious mental health problem. And people often say to me, aren't we losing our focus? Should we not be focused on patients? And my response to that is always, this is focused on patients. Because those staff who are burned out are meeting patients every day. And we know from quite significant research, this research talks about surgery, but it's been done across many of the clinical specialties. This meta-analysis on surgery shows a more than double error rate from surgeons who are burned out compared to their peers who are not. So this is a big issue for the clinical workforce, and it's a big issue for patients. And it's something I believe we need to tackle. Remember, one of those symptoms of burnout was disengagement. And this is a survey from Gallup that looked at organizations that had a highly engaged workforce, who scored high on staff engagement metrics. And it compared them with organizations that were in the lower quartile in terms of their staff engagement. And this is the difference they found. So staff who worked in highly engaged organizations had 41% lower absenteeism and 58% fewer patient safety incidents than the staff who were working in low engagement organizations. So can you imagine a single intervention that would have the impact that it has on people's well-being and joy, and also that kind of impact on patient safety? I can't. I can't think of a single more important thing for us to do. And that has only, like many, many other things, that has only been enhanced through the pandemic. I commend to you this work that's been done by Natasha Smallwood and her colleagues. It's the quantitative data is in the article that's quoted there. The book contains a lot of the qualitative data. And these slides that follow are theirs. They very kindly offered them to me. It's the biggest survey of its kind, more than 9,500 responses. It's multidisciplinary in nature. And it's, I think, a massive contribution to our understanding about what has happened to particularly the mental health of the clinical workforce during COVID. And they did this survey during the second wave of COVID in Victoria. Most of the data is from Victoria, but actually states across Australia contributed to it. And this is what they found. This is where the data that informed our standing up at the start came from. That's the proportion of staff who are burned out. So the blue bar there is self-reported data. That's staff's own perception. And the orange is using validated tools. So you can see staff significantly underreport depression and PTSD. They also underreport burnout. But a huge surge in burnout as a result of the pandemic. 70% of staff feeling burned out. 40% of staff with symptoms of PTSD. Where would we normally find PTSD? In war zones. Working in healthcare during the pandemic is like working in a war zone. Natasha and her colleagues also found particular hotspots for burnout, more risk in women and nurses, proximity to the point of care, again, relative youth, 51 is young for me at least, all of them predictors of mental health issues. So burnout was not evenly distributed across the workforce, and we've seen that elsewhere. I'll come to that in a moment. This is also really interesting from their survey. They looked at where were people going for support. And look at the tiny proportion of staff that access the things that healthcare organisations typically provide during these kind of crises. Those workplace assistance schemes or the external professional support, barely anybody thought that useful. And instead they were muddling through with a range of informal supports. The qualitative data is just as powerful as the quantitative data. I won't read all of this out. I'll just leave it on the screen for you to look at. But the one in the top right-hand corner just breaks my heart every time I read it. COVID-19 just amplified the cracks of the system. I often came home feeling defeated and too tired to take care of my own physical and mental health. Imagine how that person felt going home to their family every day. And that health equity issue also is across geographical boundaries. This is data from the CDC that shows people of colour much more adversely affected by burnout than their white counterparts. So burnout not equitably distributed across the workforce, and similar trends that we see as we look at the burden of COVID-19 on the general population. I've spent quite a long time laying out the problem. I'm just taking Einstein's advice, which is usually wise, I think. And I think it's really important that we understand the scale, the scope, and the nature of the problem, because this is very complex territory. There are no simple solutions here. However, unfortunately, that hasn't prevented people from offering them. And so I want to spend the rest of this session with you discussing some of those, because there is quite a lot of mythical thinking, some oversimplification of what's a complex problem, some fallacy, and in some areas, just some room for debate. So let's tackle some of those. This is probably the one I hear most often, that it's all about resilience. I call this the just pull yourself together school of thought. The proponents of this, I hear them say always, if they would just pull themselves together. It's always someone else that needs to get a grip. The proponents of this theory are magically protected from the consequences of burnout, it would appear. And look, I'm not arguing against resilience per se. It's just not all about resilience. I'm sure it's helpful for those positive inputs to outweigh the negative inputs and raise our coping reserve. I'm sure that's a helpful thing. However, it's when arguments for it's all about resilience, for just pull yourself together, get towards the bottom of that slide that there's a bit of a problem. Because that's suggesting at least that burnout and resilience are two quite separate outcomes. And that's not borne out by the evidence. It's perfectly possible to be highly resilient and burned out. And indeed, one of the findings from the study that we've just discussed in Victoria and the rest of Australia was that there was already high levels of resilience in that group. They used a 4-point resilience scale, and the mean score was 3.2. These people, 70% of whom were burned out and 40% of whom had symptoms of PTSD, were already highly resilient. So why was it they were suffering burnout? Well, it must be about more than resilience. Also, we look for resilience in the wrong place. People don't find resilience in those formal supports. They barely access them. They don't find it in formal training. You heard a little bit from Ashley Bloomfield yesterday about where he finds it. It's on a mountain bike going down a hill somewhere in New Zealand. For me, I get my resilience from my grandkids and my golf. We all get our resilience in different kind of places, but I don't think we get it too often in a training program. There's a growing evidence base that suggests that we don't really know whether this stuff works. And yet I see healthcare organizations investing massive sums of money in this as an antidote to burnout, as a creator of workforce wellness, and we're not sure that it works. And I think crucially, we see resilience as some kind of response to a crisis or an emergency. And we give the workforce a dose of resilience. And I think that's the wrong way to think about it. So what would better look like? What might the truth look like? Well, we at IHI, as we were creating our theory about joy in work, drew very heavily on the work of this man. This is Aaron Antonovsky. Antonovsky did a lot of his research studying the Israeli women who had survived the Holocaust. So they had been through some of the most horrific experiences that you could possibly imagine. And what he saw when he looked at that group and he researched and spoke to them was much higher levels of self-reported good health than he expected to find, and a high number of those women who were thriving. And so he sought to understand why. Why was it that these people could thrive in the light of the most difficult circumstances you could imagine. And he identified this thing that he called a life orientation, a process, an ability to function in the light of changing circumstances. And he called that life orientation a sense of coherence. And a sense of coherence really just has three components. These people who were thriving were able to make sense of their lives. They could find structure and predictability in their lives. They had some of the supports that they needed to thrive, that they could find a way to manage their way through. And they had a strong sense of meaning and purpose. They were passionate about something. And if we translate that to our workforce, what might create a sense of coherence in them, something that was not a coping strategy that we might deploy in an emergency, but rather a resource that was constant and replenishing, well, their work would make sense to them. They would understand what it is they were supposed to do. They would feel supported in that activity so that they could be successful in it. And they would have a sense of meaning and purpose. They would understand why it was they were doing what they were doing. And this, I think, ought to be our focus. Not specifically on resilience in a crisis, but on building a sense of coherence into our daily activities. This is something we could do every single day. I'm going to have a drink now because I wish I'd have a stronger drink. Those of you who have seen me speak before know that I have had a whiskey occasionally on stage, but that's just water. Oh, that's no good. I'm going to get into quite controversial territory. Some of you won't like this next bit. As I described what I was going to say to a few people who I know and trust, and they said, "You're really going to go there?" And I am. And they said, "Are you sure?" And I'm not. I'm not sure. I don't know whether what I'm about to tell you is right. I just know I'm worried about it, and I have some questions. And I thought, I can't let an opportunity like this pass without exploring some of those questions and seeing if you can help me deal with some of my worries. So I'm worried about kindness. And that maybe seems like an odd thing to say, but I'm worried about kindness. Have a look at that chalkboard part of the slide. What do you notice? Who benefits from kindness? Largely, it's the donor. Largely, it's the donor. And that's part of my first worry about it is, well, we've seen the toll that burnout takes on our workforce. They're detached and emotionally blunted. Are they going to be able to access these kind of benefits? Or are these benefits only available to people who are not burned out? I worry about that. And yet kindness is like this it's a juggernaut right now. Have you noticed? Kindness is offered as the answer to pretty much anything at the moment. It's become a panacea. You know you've arrived as a kind of concept when you get your own day. Random Acts of Kindness Day is the 17th of February. Today, incidentally, which is apt, Ashley, is Wine and Cheese Day. Sign me up. I have no worries about that whatsoever. When I was researching this, some of you are saying there, he's researched this, really? When I was researching this, I found this, and it just made me smile, and I wanted to share it with you because it just made me smile. 9 ideas for random acts. What's random about that? 9 ideas. It's bizarre. And what's even worse is that kindness is not random at all, it turns out. Kindness is selective. The underpinning resource for kindness, empathy, is allocated by clinicians in a very inequitable way. If you're a rich white guy like me, you'll get empathy and kindness. If you're poor or black, not so much. So that worries me about kindness. It's inequitably distributed. And as we've heard, some of the people who need it most are poorer or black. And then the third thing that really concerns me, this is really derives from a piece of work I did when I went home to Scotland. A couple of years ago, I was asked by the First Minister to chair an independent review of adult social care in Scotland. Joran helped me. And we had thousands of conversations with people. I spoke to literally thousands of people who needed social care support. And we started every conversation with them by asking them what mattered to them, what was important to them. And kindness came back not once. No one ever said to us, I want kindness. And it puzzled me because I was aware from my healthcare experience that kindness was everywhere, and somehow in social care, it was nowhere. And so at one of our smaller group conversations, I talked to a young disabled woman called Susan. Susan had been incredibly thoughtful and helpful in a number of our previous discussions, and I knew she would have an opinion about this. And so I asked her, I said, Susan, help me understand why kindness doesn't come up as an issue in these conversations. And she thought for a while, and then she said, Derek, 2 things. Firstly, from where I am, kindness is half a step away from pity. And I don't want anybody's pity. And secondly, and I think more profoundly for the conversation that we're having, she said, Derek, I have a right to independent living. That was Susan's big passion. She was in a wheelchair. She passed away recently, sadly. But she was in a wheelchair. And what mattered to her was her independent living. She said, Derek, I have a right to independent living. That right should not be contingent on someone else's choice as to whether to be kind. And if Deming is right, remember we parked that idea of joy in work as a right. If Deming is correct and people are entitled to joy in work, why should joy in work be dependent on kindness? Why should our joy in work be dependent on the kindness of others and the choices that they make? So those are some of my concerns, and it bothers me. I want to get somewhere with this, and so I found a way. I found things that helped me make sense of it, and so this is my truth. And I found them in an unlikely source. I'm not a particularly spiritual person, but I found my answers, at least, in the work of a Catholic priest and a Buddhist nun. The Catholic priest is Father Greg Boyle. Greg Boyle is a priest in Los Angeles. He's also the founder of Homeboy Industries. Homeboy is the biggest global program for former gang members, for the rehabilitation of former gang members. And I got to visit with Homeboy a few years back, and the stuff they do is just remarkable. They've completely transformed the lives of those gang members. They are, incidentally, also the world's biggest tattoo removal organization. When I was looking at this earlier, and I was wishing I'd brought my Homeboy Industries T-shirt with me, which I bought. No gifts at Homeboy, you have to buy stuff. But it reads, "The best protection for a bullet is a job." And that's what they do. And this was a bit of a kind of aha moment for me, because this is what I was looking for. This kind of path through compassion to something that I think might be more helpful to us. Because at least with compassion, you have to understand people's suffering. And people are suffering. But even more kind of resonant for me was this idea that compassion is not a relationship between the wounded and the healer. There's no superior and inferior, no power dynamic at play, but rather it's a covenant between equals. And Father Greg calls this kind of compassion radical kinship. He describes radical kinship as being about relationships, togetherness. In his book, Tattoos on the Heart, he says that we should have a compassion that does not stand in judgment of those who are suffering, but stands in awe of the burden that they carry. It's different. It's not transactional. And Father Greg got a lot of his ideas around this radical kinship from this lady, Pema Chodron. And Pema talks about compassion not coming from wanting to help those less fortunate than ourselves, but from realizing our kinship with all beings. And if you get your hands on it, there's a fantastic podcast where Pema and Father Greg talk about this idea of radical kinship. And they say, kinship is a circle with no one left outside. Kinship is a circle with no one left outside. And I think that's what we need. When we think about stuff that will help us get to well-being and joy, I think what we need is radical kinship. A circle where no one feels left out. Something that's about mutuality and our basic humanity, not a choice. Not the kind of things, powerful as kindness might be in certain circumstances, it's still transactional and fleeting and selective. Whereas kinship is a circle with no one left outside. Imagine the culture that we might be able to generate if we could build radical kinship in our organizations. And I want to come to culture, but only after I've had another drink. Yep, still water. No, it's sparkling. Haha, no, still water. So any notion that we can tackle this issue without changing the underlying culture of working in healthcare, I think is just crazy. Have a look at that data. 94% of healthcare workers experience unprofessional behaviour at work, such as bullying, in a 12-month period. 40% of that group experience bullying at least weekly over that 12-month period. That's our culture in healthcare. It's a culture of incivility, which leads to fear, which leads to an absence of psychological safety. And how can we ever find joy without psychological safety? Anybody have any idea what these things have in common? These three tragedies: the tragic crash of the Challenger, the environmental disaster that was the BP oil spill, and the horrific failure of care and loss of life at Mid-Staffordshire. Any ideas? Just shout out if you want. People knew, did someone say? People knew. But the culture of those organisations were that despite the fact that people knew, they couldn't be heard. They either couldn't say because of the fear and the absence of psychological safety, or they couldn't be heard because the culture of the organisation wouldn't let them be heard. These were failures of culture as much as they were failures of process. And if ever I'm talking to anybody about culture, this is where I go for inspiration. I go to Edgar Schein. Someone mentioned him. Oh, it was Ewan, that other Scottish guy. That's probably because I've recommended Ed Schein's book. I recommend it to everybody. So I'm not on commission, although I kind of feel I should be. But anyway, if you want to start reading about culture, start with Ed Schein and start with a book called Humble Inquiry, which is dead easy to read. It's only about 180 pages or something, and it's the most insightful thing. It's probably the book that's had the biggest influence on the way I go about my work in my whole life. Ed says the only thing of real importance that leaders do is create and manage culture. And I used to think he was just exaggerating. It's not the only thing, surely, Ed. But the older I've got, the more I think he's right. It's the only thing of real value that we do, is create and manage culture. And I have never talked to a leader who looks back on their career and says, you know, I wish I'd spent less time on that culture thing. Everybody regrets not paying enough attention to culture. And we're not going to create joy in work and well-being for our workforce without paying attention to culture. Ed will teach us that culture is a product of what organizations learn from dealing with problems and organize themselves to deal with those problems. And your culture always helps you or hinders in problem solving. The good news is we get to choose. We get to choose whether our culture helps us or hinders us, creating well-being in our workforce and joy in work. But we have to choose to solve problems differently. Culture is a group phenomenon. A number of speakers have touched on this. The idea that we should not act alone. It's true, I think, that chief executives and other senior staff have a particular responsibility about culture, but culture is really about what happens in groups and in relationships. And Ed's final warning to us is don't focus on culture because it's a bottomless pit. Instead, get groups involved in solving problems differently. That will change your culture. People think that a culture is fixed. Culture is very dynamic, malleable, open for us to change. So let's change it. And here's an example of someone who's creating and managing culture. I'm conscious I'm doing this in Australia. Normally, when I show this video, no one's seen this guy or heard of him. Some of you might have, and you might even have seen the video before. But if you have, look at it this time through the lens of General Morrison's attempt to create and manage culture. I've used this video largely in the past about transparency, actually. But what he's doing here is creating and managing culture. He's got his own way of doing it, but that's what he's doing.
Earlier today, I addressed the media, and through them the Australian public, about ongoing investigations into a group of officers and NCOs whose conduct, if proven, has not only brought the Australian Army into disrepute, but has let down every one of you and all of those whose past service has won the respect of our nation. There are limits to how much I can tell you because the investigations into this network by both the New South Wales Police and the ADF Investigative Service are ongoing. But evidence collected to date has identified a group of men within our ranks who have allegedly produced highly inappropriate material, demeaning women, and distributed it across the internet and Defence's email networks. If this is true, then the actions of these members are in direct contravention to every value the Australian Army stands for. By now, I assume you know my attitude to this type of conduct. I have stated categorically many times that the Army has to be an inclusive organisation in which every soldier, man and woman, is able to reach their full potential and is encouraged to do so. Those who think that it is okay to behave in a way that demeans or exploits their colleagues have no place in this Army. Our service has been engaged in continuous operations since 1999 and in its longest war ever in Afghanistan. On all operations, female soldiers and officers have proven themselves worthy of the best traditions of the Australian Army. They are vital to us maintaining our capability now and into the future. If that does not suit you, then get out. You may find another employer where your attitude and behaviour is acceptable, but I doubt it. The same goes for those who think that toughness is built on humiliating others. Every one of us is responsible for the culture and reputation of our Army and the environment in which we work. If you become aware of any individual degrading another, then show moral courage and take a stand against it. No one has ever explained to me how the exploitation or degradation of others enhances capability or honours the traditions of the Australian Army. I will be ruthless in ridding the Army of people who cannot live up to its values, and I need every one of you to support me in achieving this. The standard you walk past is the standard you accept. That goes for all of us, but especially those who by their rank have a leadership role. If we are a great national institution, if we care about the legacy left to us by those who have served before us, if we care about the legacy we leave to those who, in turn, will protect and secure Australia, then it is up to us to make a difference. If you're not up to it, find something else to do with your life. There is no place for you amongst this band of brothers and sisters.
So people often think that culture is soft. You know, so people talk about soft skills. Creating and managing culture involved me taking some of the most difficult decisions I ever had to take. But there's a leader who is willing to be clear about what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. We are willing to accept 94% of people experiencing unprofessional behaviour. We're not going to get to joy in work and well-being unless we're willing to change our culture. My fourth and final myth is somehow, if we just sit this out, things will go back to how they were. And there's a few problems with that. Firstly, as I showed you with that slide, where the 35 to 54% of clinicians were burned out, things were not very good in the good old days. Secondly, hope is not a plan. And third, people are exhausted. Absolutely exhausted. And the one thing they need above everything else is to see us doing something about it. So things are just not going to go back to how they were, and we shouldn't let them. Closely associated with this myth is this one. If I had a dollar for every time someone says to me after I give this presentation, they'll say, but Derek, what's the one thing? Tell me the one thing we should do. And I say, the one thing you should do is stop thinking there's one thing. This is the biggest problem that we're facing in healthcare. There's no one thing. There's no magic bullet. However, what we're learning from the work we're doing in Victoria with Safer Care Victoria and the Victorian Worker Wellbeing Programme, and work that IHI has done all over the world with hundreds and hundreds of teams now, is that there's a systematic way of doing this. And it starts with these 4 steps and this question. So the question is familiar to many of you. Ask our staff what matters to them. The important thing, however, is not asking the question. The important thing is listening to the answer. And I get frustrated a little bit by a perception that we can stop as soon as we've asked people what matters to them. And we can just stop. In the original iteration of What Matters to You, the concept of that came from Michael Barry and Susan Edgman-Levitan. And they saw the What Matters to You question as a vehicle for shared decision-making. And that's the way we're thinking about it here. The question is a vehicle for shared decision-making. So we're going to make some shared decisions then about what are the unique impediments to joy in our environment, in our team, in our unit, in our ward, whatever we choose to improve. And those impediments are often very different from unit to unit. Joy in work is incredibly sensitive to context. You can't roll it out. You have to intentionally build it unit by unit. Third, we commit to making joy in work a shared responsibility at all levels. We recognize that this is a complex problem, and we recognize it's going to need shared endeavor. A shared sense of what it is we're going to try and do, and the commitment of everybody in the organization to make it happen. And then fourth, joy in work is highly amenable to improvement science. It's not different from patient safety in that regard. If you are accustomed to using improvement methods to improve patient safety, you can use exactly the same methodology to create joy in work. It works just as well, and it will realize those outcomes. This is a very busy slide. But if that first one is the how of joy in work, this is the what. So this is what we will use to create our theory of change. And you can see it consists of a set of interlocking responsibilities, a set of things for senior leaders to do, a set of things for managers and core leaders to do, and a set of things for us all to do. And the encouraging thing for me, given what I've said over the course of the last 40 minutes or so, is that these things map well onto the stuff that we've been talking about. So physical and psychological safety and meaning and purpose and autonomy and control are essentially about culture. That's the culture that we're going to try to create. Camaraderie and teamwork and participative management would be significantly enhanced if we had radical kinship. If we had a circle that no one was left outside. And wellness and resilience and the activities of daily improvement are closely associated with a sense of coherence. That's how the whole kind of framework was built, from this idea of a sense of coherence. from seeing these things as something that we can build every day, a constant, a continuous replenishing of our resources rather than a dose of resilience. So these are the kind of things, and you can use this to create your theory. And some of the teams in Victoria, in fact, all of the teams in Victoria have been doing exactly that. This is one example from Team Aroa Health. This is their driver diagram. These are the things that they've chosen to work on. Again, I won't talk you through that. You'll be able to look at the slides at your leisure. But those of you who came to our workshop yesterday will know that when this was presented yesterday, the data was also shared. And at their latest data point, the team from Aroa have now reduced burnout by 30% in 12 months. 30% in 12 months. Think about when we stood up, think about how many fewer people would have been sat down if that was the case. So the other thing people ask me is, Derek, where can I start? And so I'm going to spend the last 10 minutes, no more, talking about where to start. And if I was going to start, I would start in one of 4 places. I would start here, because as I said earlier, that's something we can do every day. We can help people see what it is they're trying to do. We can make sure that they feel supported and have an opportunity to succeed. And we can keep connecting that work to our purpose, to their story of why. Why is this important? I'm not going to dwell on that one because we've already talked about it. The other thing you could start with is constancy of purpose and creating that. That's particularly important for people just now with so much going on. A place where teams often start is by building camaraderie. And then I want to say something as I close about self-care. Again, constancy of purpose, not a new idea. It's number 1 on Dr. Deming's 7 deadly diseases, the lack of constancy of purpose. It's important because it's an essential part of meaning. And people feeling that they have meaningful work really, really matters. And they cannot find meaning in their work without purpose and some of those other things. You might not like the language of that, I don't particularly either, but it's the underlying concept stands up. People need to have a sense of mission and passion and purpose in order to have, to experience meaningful work. Why is that important? Number 1 cause of happiness in the world. Those of you who were at the session yesterday, number 1 cause of happiness, meaningful work. So if we can create meaningful work, we create happiness in work and at home. Camaraderie is important because if you have a best friend at work, you're 7 times more likely to engage fully in your work. 7 times. So cast your mind back to that graph I showed about absenteeism and patient safety incidents and how important it was for people to be engaged in their work. And think about the enhancements that we could create by building camaraderie. And people often go about that with food. And there's a good reason why you should, because there's really good information that eating together makes better teams. This is a study that was done in fire services, but it applies equally in our world. And they found stronger collaboration and better unit outcomes when teams ate together, when they broke bread together. And this last bit is really, it's for everybody, but it's particularly directed to the leaders in the room. Because sometimes you think you're invulnerable, and you're not. And the first thing I want you to understand is that vulnerability is a strength. It's not a weakness. It's weak to deny your vulnerability. It's never weak to admit your vulnerability. I used to think about this in this kind of way. I think the bit about you can't pour from an empty cup really still applies, but this is not about putting your own oxygen mask on first, I've realised, because that's a bit like my resilience argument. We only do that in a crisis. And I'd like you to care for yourself every day, so it's much more like this, I think. We don't tend to our own garden. We can't tend to anybody else's. When I first became a chief executive, I had no idea how to be a chief executive. And so I got a coach. Lovely guy called Peter Shaw. And the first question Peter asked me was, Derek, tell me how you take care of yourself. And I did not have a compelling answer for Peter. And he says, how are you supposed to take care of others if you can't take care of yourself? And he's absolutely right. I learned how to take care of myself. And so I've been trying to help other leaders since to take care of themselves. And I use this kind of simple model with them. The first thing I encourage them to do, and I'm encouraging you to do it as well, is just make peace with this. You have to do it. It's part of your job to take care of yourself. And then you can make it your own. We'll find our replenishing, our sense of coherence in different kind of places, doing different kind of things. Small things can make a huge difference. Again, for me personally, when I was a CEO and feeling under a huge amount of pressure, at the end of every day, I would put my headphones in and I would listen to my music. And as I walked to the train station, that was my signal to myself that you finished your work now, Derek. You're going home. It doesn't have to be a big change. You have to make some time for it. It's important. You can test your way. You can iterate. And I ask people always to share it because people need to hear from other leaders that I'm taking care of myself because it's important. If you're still struggling with it, I give people these 3 questions. I invite them to look in the mirror and ask themselves these 3 questions. Because it kind of depersonalizes it a little bit for them, and it sometimes helps. But take care of yourself, because you can't pour from an empty cup. We ask a lot of our leaders, and they deserve the time to take care of themselves. So, I don't think we should be building resilience for crisis. I think we should be creating a sense of coherence every day. Constant and replenishing. I think we should be bold and we should aim for radical kinship. A circle where no one stands outside. Not kindness, which can be fleeting and transactional and selective. I think we should change our culture. Not in projects, but by creating and managing culture by solving problems differently. If that's for me, I'm nearly finished. I think we should look at this systematically. There is no magic bullet. There's no one thing. But we know now, because we've worked with hundreds of teams, including some in this country, that those 4 steps and that wheel that you can use to create your theory of change can really make a difference. If it can reduce burnout by 30% in the example we showed, it can reduce it anywhere. And just start. Start somewhere. Start today. Maybe with yourself. That would be easiest. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Derek, for a great end to a great day. And I'm really glad we're going to do our bit to celebrate International Wine and Cheese Day very shortly. We hope you've had a great day today, meeting old colleagues, connecting with new ones, and starting to explore those new horizons for the future of quality improvement. Just a reminder that tomorrow morning, we have 2 breakfast sessions from our sponsors, GE Healthcare and SimConverse, which are starting at 8 a.m. And you can find more information on the flyers on your seats. And tomorrow at lunchtime, please visit the networking area in the exhibition hall to join our consumer huddle. That's hosted by the Consumer Health Forum and Health Consumers New South Wales. And also we've got the Joy in Work huddle hosted by IHI. Now we've got some very serious networking to do, so please join us in the Northwest Foyer Level 2, just outside the exhibition area, for our welcome reception. Thank you, and we'll see you tomorrow morning.